We're doing Transcendentalism tonight, and Transcendentalism is American philosophic romanticism. We already looked at the Romantics, and we looked at the European Romantics, and we looked at the American poetic Romantics, which were, of course, the fireside poets. And because they're Romantics, they hold a lot of the basic tenets of Romanticism. Many of them, they just give a slightly different emphasis or sometimes a completely different interpretation, and that probably can't be seen anymore. Obviously, in the first thing there, the essential unity of all creation. And they mean that literally. I'm going to hold that part off a little bit until we get to the transcendent one or the oversoul. But as you'll see, they mean everybody is literally one being, the oversoul. They believe in the innate goodness of man, just like the Romantics. Everybody's born good. We have a built-in moral compass. Everybody is absolutely unique. Everybody is a unique version of the good. And they give somewhat more emphasis to that than, say, the fireside poets did. That everybody is a unique version of the good, and your job is to live out your version of the good. For reasons that you'll see when we get to the oversoul or the transcendent one. All important questions are moral, just like they are with the Romantics. Everything is pretty much symbolic. You have to follow your built-in moral compass. Your code will not be the same as anybody else's. One of the things they stress more than other Romantics is that emphasis on individuality. The European Romantic poets stress that, but not as much as the Transcendentalists stress it. To them, the fact that you are unique and that you're one of a kind is really the essential nature of things. That's what you're required to be. You're not put here to be like everybody else. You're made different than anybody who's ever been before, and to the extent that you compromise that individuality, that uniqueness, you compromise your very reason for being. Supremacy of insight and intuition over logic and experience. Remember, the Romantics felt that you have a built-in moral compass, which is your feelings, your heart. Your heart tells you what's right, good feels good, and bad feels bad. What is it that gets in the way of that feeling? How do we stop feeling? The intellect. The intellect drives down the emotions. If you can't feel anything, you can't feel what's right or wrong. So, of course, like the Romantics, they feel an insight and intuition. What you feel, that's what's right. The Transcendentalists are really the original hippies. There's so many parallels between them that I'll point out, from the fact that they start out as part of a generation gap. Their parents are Ben Franklin rationalists. Franklin would have had no problem being a Unitarian. Many, if not most, of the original Transcendentalists not only came from Concord, but in general, they were New Englanders, they were young, and they were Unitarians. Unitarianism split off from Puritanism relatively early on. They disagreed. The Unitarians believed that God is a complete whole and that there isn't a God of three parts. They didn't believe in the Trinity. But remember how Puritanism started out balanced, intellectual and emotionally, went intellectual, started, and Edwards brought it back to the emotional. After them, it went back to the intellectual again. Well, Unitarianism went intellectual and just kept on going. It never swung back and forth. So that by the time the Transcendentalists come along, Unitarianism is hardly even a religion anymore. There's no single theology that all the Unitarian congregations subscribe to, and there's no passion at all involved in it. As you'll see, that's one of the things that the Transcendentalists wanted to change. And it's basically based on that idea of utility. Remember Ben Franklin, when he had his list of what he thought, where religions agreed and what he thought was right, and the last part of that was that the good we do is the good we do to other human beings. And they pretty much focused on that. Utility, that good is useful. It's useful to other people. And these are a bunch of young people who, like in the 60s, you had a very anti-sensual, anti-emotional, delayed gratification generation of adults raised on print, and then you had their children raised on television. And they were sensual, they were emotional, they were generalists rather than dealing with details. They were open to sensation rather than closed to sensation, and they just couldn't understand one another. And pretty much the same thing happens with the Transcendentalists and their parents and grandparents in Unitarianism. They're an emotional generation. Transcendentalism is tied in with another movement. It's not an organized movement. It's kind of a feeling that swept over America. And it was called Young America. Because what you have growing up in the 30s and 40s and 50s is the first generation of Americans for whom there had always been an America. Their parents and their grandparents had lived part of the time in America and part of the time in America as a British colony. So this is the first generation of true Americans. They saw themselves as unique and different. Some of the frontier has been conquered. America isn't just settling this frontier and getting established now. Things are established. They've been established for a while. And America is beginning to grow. It's not a world power yet by a long shot, but it's on its way there. And this generation of young Americans felt that it had a destiny. And in that, it's also like the hippie generation of the late 60s. That was a generation that also saw itself as unique and having some sort of moral calling in the world. That this was the generation that was going to set things right. Now, they may have been woefully wrong about that, but they had that belief. And Young America is about that. One of the things that Emerson stresses is that before the Civil War, 90% of all books published in America came from Europe and the continent. We imported our literature. We imported our culture. We imported our fashion. Everything came from overseas. Americans were ashamed of America. I know it might be de Tocqueville, but I'm not sure. Who says who reads an American book or goes to see an American play? As if the obvious answer was nobody, and who would want to. Emerson comes along and says that we need a literature by Americans, for Americans, about Americans. That America is something that there's never been before. A truly democratic country. The first country that changes power every 4 years without violence. That's something the world had never seen before. A country where, theoretically, don't forget, this wasn't necessarily true, but this is what they believed, where anybody could grow up to be president. Where there was no hereditary class of aristocrats. Where there were no interests that had been vested for 500 years. Where there was a frontier. Where anybody who couldn't make a go of things could get a second start. Where you didn't necessarily have to have an advanced education to succeed in life. It was a place where the common man had a chance to flourish. That hadn't existed before. So they saw themselves as unique, and when Emerson calls for a literature by Americans, for Americans, and about Americans, Young America answers that call. They had their magazines that they all read, and they saw themselves as this unique generation. And the Transcendentalists, of course, are part of that. And Emerson is part of sparking that whole idea, that America is a unique place, and there's never been any place like it, and that only an American could write about that, and that only Americans could really understand it when they read it. That's why he wanted that literature by Americans, for Americans, about Americans. After the Civil War, 90% of the books that are published in America are written by Americans. Now, to some extent, that was also the result, not just of Emerson's success and Transcendentalism's success, but the adoption of an international copyright law. See, prior to, I think it's 1855, there was no international copyright. And what that meant was that all you had to do was get a copy of a book from England, and you could republish it without paying any royalties to the author. The English, of course, could steal American books, but they didn't steal very many of them. That's why we didn't get to do them, but Washington Irving is one of the smartest writers and one of the first real writers in prose that America has, and he's smart enough to bring part of his book out in England and part of his books out in America, so they had both copyrights and nobody could steal from them. But everybody else wasn't as bright as Irving. So once the international copyright comes in, you got to pay royalties, and it was cheaper to hire American authors. So that sort of gave it a boost as well. But the impetus towards it is probably from Transcendentalism. They borrowed from Platonism and Neoplatonism. Remember, Plato was from the very first lecture, The Allegory of the Cave. This world is a reflection of a cosmic reality. You saw the Puritans adopt that kind of an idea, except they gave it a theological twist. The Transcendentalists accept it as a philosophy, that there is an ideal world and that this world reflects it. Although, as you'll see, they take it considerably further than that. Coleridge had said that poetry, when he defined Romanticism in Lyrical Ballads in 1796, said that poetry ought to be the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The Transcendentalists, as Unitarians, adopted that idea and wanted to apply it to Unitarianism. They wanted religion to be the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. There were almost no feelings at all in Unitarianism. People talked a lot, they thought a lot about what is the nature of the good and so on, but they didn't have any passion about it. There was no emotional reward to Unitarianism. And these young Unitarians simply wanted to apply that from Coleridge to their religion. They didn't realize, partly because they're romantics, and romantics only pay attention to the moment anyway, they didn't really realize what they had embarked on. What they thought they were going to do was to replace the older generation, the establishment, in their local Unitarian congregation. What they had actually embarked on was nothing less than a reform of the politics and the culture and the literature of America. The reason for that is, again, you notice that most of them are New Englanders. New England dominates the politics of the country. When you couldn't run for office unless you had the backing of one of the ministers. So when you replace the ministers, you change the politics. And the ministers are the arbiters of taste and morals. They're the ones who decide whether a book is going to be banned in Boston, whether it's something that's legitimate art, whether it's something that people ought to be reading or ought to be ashamed of reading if they are reading it. When you replace them, you change American culture. So they had no idea how widespread a revolution they had undertaken. They just thought, all they thought they wanted was just to get some emotion into their religious lives. To some extent, Transcendentalism is not just a philosophy, it borders on a religion. And the effect that it has is probably not much less, if less at all, than the Great Awakening, than the religious revival of Jonathan Edwards spread across the land. Transcendentalism probably influenced even more people than that did. From Carlyle, now Carlyle is a British historian and philosopher. He was a fairly big name when Emerson was young. Emerson meets him in his 20s. As you've seen, we do the Transcendental Hero. One of the things that makes, there isn't much in Emerson's life that allows you to tell him from an ordinary retired country parson. He's got a big white house. It's on the main street in town. As far as you know, there's no scandal at all about Emerson. He doesn't seem to do anything unusual and bizarre. He seems to live by the traditional code. However, when he's young, father dies early. He's been a minister. The family is close to destitute. The congregation takes up a collection. Mrs. Emerson was a nice lady, but not very business-minded and kind of flighty. Unfortunately for the Emersons, they had a spinster aunt, Aunt Mary Moody. And Aunt Mary Moody, whenever the Moody's or the Emersons had any kind of problem, any family difficulty. Aunt Mary kind of helicoptered in and parachuted in and straightened everything out, and then went on her way to the next crisis. And she comes, gets a boarding house set up for Mrs. Emerson to run, straightens the boys out. She's the one, in fact, that a lot of people trace much of Emerson's philosophy to. You've read Self-Reliance. And part of that comes from the self-reliance that Aunt Mary Moody taught them. According to the legend, Emerson and his brother had a share. In some versions it's a pair of shoes, in some versions it's a coat. And they're fighting over whose turn it is to wear it that day. And Aunt Mary Moody comes and explains to them that things like this, which seem to be obstacles, are in fact opportunities for heroism. So after that they fought over who was not going to wear the coat. But that idea of approaching life as the difficulties are opportunities for heroism, there's something to look forward to rather than something to avoid, you'll see at the basis of Emerson's philosophy. Despite not having much money, Emerson works his way through college. He becomes a minister of the second most important church in Boston. It's a great job. He marries his true love. She dies within a year of tuberculosis. He never really gets over that. And he tells the congregation that he's going to resign because he no longer believes in communion. Now he's so charismatic that they say to him, "We'll get another minister to do that. You just stay and preach the sermon." And he says, "No, I just don't feel like I can do that. I don't know what it is I'm supposed to do, but I'm going to go to Europe and wander around and try and figure it out." Now when he's there, he meets Carlyle. Carlyle is the author of the great man theory. And when we get to the transcendental hero, you'll see what an enormous effect he has on Emerson. Emerson admired Carlyle more than Carlyle admired Emerson, but they had a kind of mutual admiration society. Emerson hyped Carlyle here in the States, and Carlyle occasionally mentioned that Emerson was a pretty good thinker for an American. Now that's pretty high praise from Carlyle, because Carlyle doesn't admire anybody. Carlyle thinks he's the great man. Now the great man theory is that history is not, as it's seen in the modern approach to history, is to explain events as being the result of large-scale economic, cultural, geographical, political forces. That these forces come into conflict, and individuals who happen to be around when the forces resolve themselves get credit for having done something. But in fact, they were just pawns in the grip of a current that was much greater than themselves and just happened to carry them along. In other words, people don't really matter much in the modern view of history. It has to do with industrialization and the movements of populations, and with the history of treaties and relations between countries, but individuals don't really play much of a part. They simply express these large-scale forces. But Carlyle says that history is the story of great men. That into every generation there are special human beings born, and those human beings make history. And history is really biography. Every generation has some of these great men. They're special people. So that if you look at the Civil War, the modern view says the Civil War was won before it was ever started. The South never had a chance to win. When the Civil War starts, the South has not got a single cannonball factory. It hasn't got the armament. The North has all the factories. The North has a larger population. The North didn't win because it was right. It may have been right, but that wasn't why it won. It won because it had enough people. It could afford to get people killed and replace them, and the South couldn't. By the end of the war, the South was manning its armies with 70-year-old men and 14-year-old boys. And the North still had an awful lot of young men it could send off to get killed. It had the money. It had the industrial might. Modern view is it was destined to win. Gettysburg is the turning point, but it's really because that's where the South spends the last excess soldiery it had. And after that, it just really didn't have the reserves to keep that war up, and things get worse and worse for them. But Carlyle looks at the Civil War and says that the turning point is Gettysburg. And what it turns on is the personalities of two figures Robert E. Lee and J.E.B. Stuart. Now, J.E.B. Stuart, Jeb Stuart, is the quintessential romantic cavalry officer. Of all the military that got admired, the cavalry was most admired. They're the ones who charge in first. Any Union soldier would gladly have given his life to kill J.E.B. Stuart. And not only there was no surprise to Stuart. Stuart was not always out in the front when they made a charge. He wore a black feather in his hat so everybody knew who he was. This is a guy who believes in that whole Southern mythos of chivalry and the new chivalry of the South, and being a hero, being like a kind of medieval knight. Because he sees himself as a hero, and because he believes in daring and bravado, he was useful to Lee, because he would often circle the entire Union Army and come back and be able to report on where everybody, what their strength was and where they were positioned. It was intelligence that Lee depended on. Gettysburg's an accident. They don't start out the fight. The two armies come together without expecting to. Lee is there. No, Grant is there. Lee isn't there. I'm sorry, not Grant. Some guy in a blue coat is there anyway, running the Union Army. And the battle really gets joined without being planned. Lee isn't there, Stuart is. Stuart knows what he's supposed to do. Take his troops, gallop around, see where everybody is, come back when Lee shows up, give him the intelligence he needs. On his way, he bumps into a Union brigade. Now, the great man theory says he couldn't not give battle. He should have ignored them, gone on around, and instead, he fights a skirmish with them. He wins, and he wins pretty easily, but he never gets to make that circuit that he's supposed to make. And when Lee shows up, Stuart comes back. He's captured 5,000 mules. One of the few times that Lee ever upbraided one of his senior officers in public. And he said to Stuart, "What do you expect me to do with those mules? Put the bodies on them?" Because that wasn't what he needed. What he needed was information. Now, when he shows up, the Union Army is all there at Gettysburg. If Lee leaves 20,000 men there to their deaths, takes off for Washington, there's nobody between him and Washington. He didn't have to attack Washington. All he would have had to do was show up on the banks with that army, and there would have been an instant truce, and there would have been a peace settlement, and it would have been settled on antebellum. It would have just put everything back the way it was before the Civil War started. All he has to do is leave 20,000 men to die. Grant would have done it. Grant would have taken 3 drinks and been on his way. But Lee can't. Lee is the epitome of the Southern gentleman. Honor means more to him than anything. He can't betray the loyalty of those troops and leave them to die. So he stays and fights Gettysburg. Because he doesn't win the war. So the great man theory says this doesn't turn on industry or on money or on anything except personality. And everything turns on personality. And you'll see Emerson adopt that idea and apply it to the transcendental hero. Indian and Chinese writings from the East. And this is another way that the Transcendentalists are like the hippies. One of the ferment of the 60s was the sudden influx not only of music from India and Japan and China, but also a lot of philosophy that hadn't been seen for a while. Now it's true, the beats were fairly well read in Zen, but they were a relatively small group of people, and now suddenly Eastern philosophy became popular. And the same thing here, it floods in. Emerson and Thoreau both had in their libraries a number of copies of books by Indian writers and by Japanese and Chinese writers. The startling change is this. I don't know if you have this in the bottom of yours. But if you don't, you've seen this before, yin and yang, yin and yang. This is the Western view of the world. It's a continuum between antithetical opposites. Good and evil, light and dark, negative and positive. active and passive. That these categories are mutually exclusive and mutually annihilatory. And that as you pass along the continuum, eventually one wipes out the other. In other words, the Western view is things are moving along this continuum until they get to be all one. All good, all active, all whatever. This is the Eastern view. And what it says is the world is not linear. The world is circular. That what you have is not two opposite forces, but two opposite aspects of the same force. A negative and a positive pole to it, an active and a passive pole, good and evil, light and dark. These don't annihilate one another. They go in and out of balance. One or the other is in the ascendant. That's why you notice that the head of one goes into the tail of the other. And you have a white dot on the black side and a black dot on the white side. And the indication there is that the seeds of the antithesis are always present. And you notice that the further you push one of these, the more certainly you go into its opposite. The more active you become, if you take the active force and you run it to its absolute extreme, the more active you become, the more certain it is that you're going to run out of energy and have to become completely passive. Conversely, the more passive you are, the more certain it is that passivity is going to become unbearable and you'll have to be active. No matter how good something is, it has the seeds of its antithesis if it's taken far enough. So that's why so often reforms which start out to be beneficial are carried to their extremes and just the opposite happens. And there's this continual balance to the universe. It's always going the further it goes in one direction, the more certain it is to pop around into the other. And things go in and out of balance, and it's circular. And so the idea is to be aware of both sides. No side is wrong or right. They're simply opposite aspects of the same force. It's the Tao. It's the flow of things. And you'll see them pick up that idea of the flow of things also when we look at the Transcendent One. Mr. Hicks?
Does it mean then don't do anything to the extreme? Is that what that really means? Or?
It's not quite what the classicists. The classicists said that, stay in the middle. What they said is it's going to go to the extreme. No matter what it is, this force, whatever the force is, it will always end up going to the extreme and bring about its opposite. That no matter what you do, you won't be able to maintain that balance. The universe keeps righting itself. And it rights itself by going to extremes and flipping over. And the further it goes into one. It sounds similar to the classical idea of Stoicism. Remember, keep things right in the middle. But it's really not. It's that things are always going out of balance and coming back in. So it's always kind of an adventure. And there isn't a lot you can do except try to balance yourself. You're going to get swept along by the nature of things. Now the Transcendentalists, remember the Transcendentalists don't take these ideas whole and accept them completely. They take them, and even where they're contradictory, they keep them. They don't care about contradiction. That's, let's see, where's that? Dialectical thinking. Oh, down at G for under number 10. Dialectical thinking. It means that you can hold two completely opposite ideas in your mind at the same time, accepting both of them as true and not bothered in the least by the fact that they contradict one another. And the reason, of course, for that is that the Romantics don't believe in logic anyway. So if you're logically inconsistent, they don't find that a problem. Logic is reason, reason is the intellect is always wrong. You have to follow your heart. And your heart could follow two things that seem to be intellectually contradictory, may be emotionally the same thing. So they don't worry about contradictions. They don't really try to defend them that much. This view of the world following the flow they adopt from Swedenborg. Swedenborg had a long a philosophy that basically said heaven is like Brookdale. You go through a series of learning experiences, and that moves you to another objective where you get another series of learning experiences that take you to a higher objective. And that there are a series basically of lives, not all necessarily on the physical plane, in which you learn more and more, and that allows you to pass to the next level. And it's very elaborate, and he spells out all the different levels and things. It almost gets to be like the medieval hierarchies of angels and how you move up. But that idea that life is largely an evolutionary experience towards a greater and greater good is an idea that they'll bring back. Eclectic and cosmopolitan. Eclectic means they take little pieces from everywhere. They take a lot of different philosophies. They don't accept any of them whole. They just take parts of them and build something new out of the parts of all these different philosophies. And cosmopolitan, despite their emphasis on America and the significance of being American, they nevertheless took ideas wherever they found them. Not only from Europe, but also from the Middle East and the Far East. They're part of that 19th century generation gap. They're the proponents of a new culture. They want the building part of America is no longer as significant as the intellectual and spiritual growth of America. Now, some of that had to do with the frontier being settled and less of the work having to be done. On the frontier, there was always too much work to do. But further back, towards the coasts, that had been around for a long time. Things are pretty well set up. People had more leisure time. And now Americans want to spend that, and they want to spend it learning. They want some meaning for their lives. Religion is not entirely in retreat yet, but it's starting to be. And as far as they were concerned, it had been in retreat for a while because the intellect had taken over in Unitarianism. They rejected the conventional, as romantics almost always do. When you say you have to be you have to reject convention. You have to reject convention, you have to reject culture, you have to reject the law, you have to reject tradition. All of those things are a series of rules made up by dead people about how you ought to be you. And there's never been a you before, so who's the only expert on how to be you? You are. So you can't follow any of these rules. Now, they aren't as extreme about rejecting that convention as the European Romantic poets were. You don't find the kind of bizarre, at best, behavior among the Transcendentalists. They believed in rejecting convention, but when you look at them, most of them aren't that radical. Whitman, yes, because he's a homosexual and he isn't very far underground. That was a dangerous thing to do. That was a radical thing to do. Emily Dickinson withdrawing from the world. Yeah, it's extreme for a woman of her time not to marry and to not have any social obligations or responsibilities and to withdraw, but it's not, there's nobody as scary as Byron. There's not a whole lot of drug users, and there's no orgies among the Transcendentalists. You don't have the wild behavior. They reject the conventional, but as with a lot of things, much of it's theoretical rather than practical. Again, Emerson is the theoretician of Transcendentalism. He lays the philosophical groundwork, and yet his life doesn't seem to follow it very much. There's not many really radical things that Emerson does. His life doesn't stand out as usual. And when you look at Thoreau, yeah, Thoreau was one of a kind, but he didn't scare anybody with his differences. People kind of liked having Thoreau around. They liked the idea that somebody could live the way he lived. It gave them the feeling that maybe they didn't have to live the way they did. We looked at number 8 already. They were reform-minded. They wanted to change things. They thought there was a lot that new America could do about the flaws of old America. And if Transcendentalism hadn't gotten caught up in a single issue that dominated its thinking from the late 1850s onward, a great many reforms that are present, that have recently come into being, would have come into being 100 years earlier. For example, feminism. When you say that everybody is unique, everybody is one of a kind, everybody is of equal value, we're all priceless, can you then make distinctions on the basis of gender? No. One unique, priceless person is the same as another unique, priceless person. You can't say somebody's worth more than somebody else. That idea that women were the intellectual and spiritual and moral equals of men gets a lot of impetus from Transcendentalism. And they lived by their philosophy. Although Emerson is the theoretician of the movement, Margaret Fuller has more to do with its public face than Emerson does. Transcendentalism publishes its own magazine, The Dial. And the editor for the first 3 years is Margaret Fuller, a woman. Nobody thought twice about putting a woman in charge. And what that meant, that was in her selection of the articles and the stories and the poems that The Dial published, she presented to the public what Transcendentalism was. So she had probably as much of an impact as Emerson did. Now probably, first women's movement, first convention of a women's movement is the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. You see it fits right into this period. And the Transcendentalists would have pushed for feminism, so that the kinds of equality we've managed to achieve in the last 30, 40 years could have been done in 1860 and 70 and 80 instead of 1960, 70 and 80. So we could have got there 100 years ago. Educational reform. At the time, education, primary and secondary education, was largely a matter of the professor told the students the facts, and then they were required to tell them back to him, and if they couldn't, he beat them. You were expected to beat your students. Thoreau teaches for a short period of time in the public school. And the principal upbraids him for not feeding his students enough. That he's sparing the rod and spoiling the child. Thoreau calls up his 3 brightest students, spanks all 3 of them, says to the principal, "Are they any smarter now?" and turns in his resignation. When he taught in his brother's school, however, he taught in a transcendental way. Actually, he taught in a transcendental way even in the public school, but they just didn't want him to do it. For example, he's way ahead of his time, about 70 years, in what education majors call learn by doing. And it's, I can't remember what Dewey's first name is anymore. Anyway, his last name is Dewey, and he's the most prominent, about 1910 or so, he's the most prominent educational theorist, and he's the guy who invents things like the field trip. Dewey's philosophy of education is this: if you present knowledge to people who have no reason for wanting to know what you're presenting to them, they're probably not going to learn it. So the first task of an educator is to create a necessity for that knowledge in his students. So that Thoreau would take, instead of teaching multiplication tables and how to do board feet, Thoreau would take his students out into the woods. Say, "What do you think of that tree?" "It's a nice tree, Mr. Thoreau. It's a big tree." "Hey, you know what kind of tree it is?" "Hickory?" "No, it's a pine tree." What do you make out of pine trees?" "I don't know." "Houses. If you owned that tree, do you know how many houses you could make?" "No." "Would you like to know?" "Yeah." "Okay, what do you know about multiplication?" "I know that pretty good." "Okay, let me tell you about board feet." Now's the reason for you want to know about board feet, because you want to know, if I owned that tree, how much would I be able to do with it? There's a reason for wanting to know that knowledge. So that's an advance that into the kind of education. Brookdale could have been founded 100 years earlier. It could have been founded in 1869 instead of 1969. And basically on the same premise. I mean, it's not the premise that Brookdale runs on now. Brookdale has now become neoclassical education. Everything is very formalized. But when Brookdale started out, most people didn't come here to get a better ticket to the job world. If you ask students why they were here, about 80% of them would say they came to find themselves. They came to find out who they were. The idea was you take the talents and abilities of students and you help them develop those to their fullest potential. But they set the agenda. You don't set the agenda. That's, of course, no longer the case. But that kind of education could have flourished 100 years earlier. One of the unique things about reform was that it was different in America than anywhere else in the world before, or even at the time, in that when people identified social problems in other countries, they got together and went to the powers that be and pointed out the problems and asked to have them redressed. They went to the parliament, they went to the king, they said, here's the problem, here's how we think you could fix it, please fix it. Americans don't, or didn't anyway then. Americans solved their own problems. They solved them from the grassroots. For example, alcoholism was a major social problem. Americans were world-class drinkers. There were no restrictions whatsoever on alcohol. Drunken 12-year-olds were a common sight. Instead of going to the government and saying some restrictions need to be placed on the use of alcohol, some sort of rehabilitation has to be given for people who want to stop being addicted to it, instead, a group of drunks met in Baltimore. And they were sitting around talking about how demon rum had destroyed their lives and the lives of their families. And they talked about how they really wished they could stop drinking. And they hit on the idea of helping one another do that. So whenever somebody wanted to go back to drink, his friends would show up and talk him out of it. And this idea spreads until pretty soon you have the women's, within 10 years you have the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is providing a kind of rehab facilities, they didn't just start recently, for people who want to get off alcohol. And going beyond that and become politically active and being even activist in the sense of going in and smashing up bars like Carrie Nation did with her little hatchet. But the important thing here is that you have Americans solving a problem for themselves without government intervention. A similar problem is education. Few people went as far as 8th grade. Largely agrarian society. The whole school year was set up in relation to the harvest and farming. By the time a boy got to be 13 or 14, the family just couldn't afford to have him in school. They needed him working on the farm. As a result, you had a lot of people who liked learning but no longer had an access. Now they're 20, they're 25, they're 30 years old, they still want to learn. They don't want to go back and sit in those little teeny desks in the one-room schoolhouse with a bunch of children, but they do still want to learn. But they don't go to the government and say, you need to establish adult education. We need evening division classes. We need community colleges. Instead, they're sitting around and they say, well, you know, it would be nice if we could learn some new stuff. And somebody else says, yeah, but there's no real apparatus for that, but maybe we could teach one another. Each one of us probably has some expertise. I know a lot about beekeeping. People want to know about it, I'd be happy to tell about it. So, okay, next week you tell everybody about beekeeping. And the week after that, the blacksmith will tell us important ways to maintain your horse's shoes. And the week after that, somebody who does knitting will show us different ways to knit. And of course, it's small towns, so eventually you run out of expertise. But by the time that happens, the Chautauqua movement had already developed. A loosely organized army, really, of speakers that, for money, went from town to town, delivering the equivalent of high school or college classes, single lectures, for a price. And they had big tents. Remember, people were so desperate that they went to see preachers as a form of entertainment. So anything that wasn't connected with religion, and they were used to going to listen to people talk as a way of being amused. And now here's a way of being informed at the same time as being entertained. Emerson, although he really inherits his money from his first wife, augments that income by being a public speaker. And he goes on tour. It's one of the kind of ironic differences between Thoreau and Emerson. Emerson was very successful as a public speaker. He tried to get Thoreau to become one. And Thoreau did set up some lectures, but Thoreau was just not successful at it at all. And this is what makes it ironic. Emerson theoretically believed that everybody was equal, but he was still kind of a patrician. He would talk to ordinary people, but he was never one of them. But when he gave his lectures, he would test out the audience with a few things first to see what they liked and what they didn't like, and he would modify them to appeal to the audience. Thoreau, who could fit in anywhere and could sit around with a bunch of people digging ditches who were taking their break, Emerson would never have sat down on a pile of dirt and talked about hard work with them. For one thing, Emerson didn't know anything about hard work. Secondly, he was, again, he's that reserved, aloof minister who stands apart. Although Thoreau could talk to anybody and was a common man himself, when he came to his lectures, he didn't bring them down to the level that his audience happened to be at. Instead, he used his enthusiasm, and he saw that as the main point. There's that legend that a woman comes to Thoreau when he was going to lecture and said, "Is it going to be interesting?" And Thoreau said, "It's going to be interesting to me." And that was all that mattered to Thoreau. He was going to have a good time. So he kind of failed in that ability to be able to express himself. In any case, the reform movement is grassroots in America, and Transcendentalism would have been a handy mechanism to move all these reforms forward. Things like prison reform, the reform of insane asylums. Generally, if you could possibly keep your relatives out of an institution, you would have done it, and you would have gone a long way to do it, because once you had them committed, their lives were worse than the lives of animals. They were generally chained up. They were rarely clean. They laid around in their own filth. If they made noise, they were beaten and tortured. They were abused. Nothing was really done to try to help them or rehabilitate them. They were just considered unmanageable, and they were insane, and they were treated pretty badly. And one of the things that brings reform about grassroots is this idea of having the reform of mental institutions. Because generally, somebody in your family had emotional or mental problems, you chained them up yourself in the basement or the attic if they were violent. And you told everybody they went away.
I just don't know how well structured are the institutions and stuff.
There are government institutions. Now a lot of the asylums were privately run, which is another reason why everybody was abused. As soon as you start outsourcing the private industry, it's not profitable to treat people humanely, and that might have been part of why they weren't. A lot of them were run by charities, but nobody was overseeing those charities. Everybody's saying, "Oh, yeah, here's some money to help the mad people," but nobody's going and seeing how that money was spent, and a lot of it was badly spent, and a lot of it was abusive, and so they wanted that reform, and that reform would probably have gone forward if Transcendentalism didn't get caught up. Another one was free love. The sexual revolution might have happened in 1869 or 1865 or whatever instead of 1965. Of course, one of the reasons why the hippie revolution coincides with the sexual revolution has nothing to do with philosophy. It has to do with technology. What is it?
Oh.
The pill, adequate birth control. Birth control that allowed sex to be recreational. The theory of recreational sex is around in the 19th century. It's called free love. And of course you can see why the Romantics would adhere to that. If it feels good, it is good. You don't need a license. You don't need permission from the state to follow your heart. If you love somebody and you're attracted to them, you should be able to act on that. And the Transcendentalists believed in free love. They didn't practice it all that much. Hawthorne, then there's another thing that they're like the hippies. They established communes. Now communes had been around since the Puritans. When the Bradford's group landed, they're communalists. They're communists the first year. They hold the land in common. Problem is, everybody's showing up for sick call. Nobody wants to work, everybody wants to eat. Doesn't work very well. They become capitalists the second year. Everybody gets their own piece of land. You don't work it, you starve. That's your problem. There had been communes, some like the Broderbund, that had lasted since the 1700s. Generally they were religious, and usually they took an industry of some kind, like making furniture. And the commune did that and lived communally off the wealth. Well, they set up some communes. Now they set them up for a different reason than previous communes. They weren't religiously oriented. Again, they were transcendentalists. Their original idea was to set up the commune at Brook Farm to demonstrate that work was ennobling. The idea in those days was that if you worked with your mind, you were somehow superior to people who worked with their hands. And the people who worked with their hands were morally less and intellectually less than people who didn't. And the Transcendentalists set out to prove that that wasn't true. So they were going to set up this farm. Now, there were several problems with that. First of all, you got people like Bronson Alcott. Emerson collected people that he thought were going to become somebody. And he encouraged them. He often financed them, or he got other people to finance them. They never really panned out their satisfaction. And as you'll see, that's a contradiction in Emerson's own philosophy that he just didn't seem aware of. Well, Bronson Alcott had these advanced ideas about education, similar to what I mentioned for Thoreau. And Emerson got some money so that he could go to England and promote those ideas. But every time Bronson Alcott set up a school, this is Louisa May Alcott's father, she goes into writing novels to try to keep the family together because Bronson just can't earn a living. And he can't handle money at all. If it wasn't for Mrs. Alcott, they'd have all starved. They set up the commune of Brook Farm, and guess who they make the treasurer? Bronson Alcott. Like, they could have named some of the livestock as treasurer and done better. The other problem is they're running a farm. Now, farm work now is long and difficult. Farm work in the 19th century is endless, brutal labor. It requires some physical skills. Most of these are people who had always earned, either they had money, or if they earned their money, they earned it by thinking. They didn't have any practical skills. Hawthorne goes there, they have a manure machine. They have to keep Hawthorne away from it because he breaks it every time he goes near it. Finally give him a pitchfork and say, here, you try not to stab yourself with this thing. Throw the manure up with that. They're all inept. And so within a year or so, the place folds. And what they went there to prove, they ended up disproving. They wanted to prove that the fact that you worked with your hands didn't mean you couldn't have a life of the mind. But what happens when you work 15 hours a day at hard labor? You want to talk transcendentalism when you get home? No, you just want to lay down and go to sleep. So there weren't a lot of these philosophical discussions they thought they were going to have. And what they ended up proving was, no, working class people aren't any less intellectual than the wealthier classes. They're just more tired because they work for real. Hawthorne goes there to make some money so that he can marry his fiancée, Sarah Peabody. But I'm not entirely sure that Hawthorne didn't go there because the Transcendentalists practiced free love. And he thought, maybe this is one last fling before marriage. But of course they would talk all about free love and how if somebody attracted you, you ought to go off to bed with them. And then it got to be 8:30 or 9 o'clock and everybody was yawning and Hawthorne was saying, well, like, shouldn't we like workshop this or something? Pair up and see if this really... That's not a bad idea, Nathaniel, but not tonight. We're all just too tired and then we go off to bed. So nothing much really happened there. Maybe Margaret Fuller had a couple of affairs with different guys, but that was about it. And Margaret, as you'll see if we get a chance to look at Margaret Fuller, was one of her great breakthroughs was that women had a sex drive. And she discovered hers in her 30s, and it was like a child with a new toy. So she was about the only one who practiced free love. The rest of them really just talked about it. But all those things, those revolutions that occur 100 years later might have occurred 100 years earlier. But Transcendentalism becomes a one reform philosophy, and that one issue is abolitionism. The abolition of slavery. And you could see how that would preoccupy them. If you say everybody is an individual, and everybody has a responsibility to be themselves above all else, then an institution which not only won't let people be individuals, but treats them like property, and badly treats them like property, has obviously got to be abolished. And so more and more Transcendentalism and abolitionism became almost synonymous. There's another big difference between Emerson and Thoreau. Emerson doesn't get active in abolitionism until the Civil War starts. Thoreau's family's house was a stop on the Underground Railroad that smuggled slaves north to Canada. When you look at Emerson, Emerson is the theoretician, Thoreau is the guy who puts it into practice. So all of these reforms could have come about a lot earlier. And to some extent that being almost obsessed with abolitionism has a lot to do with the fading away of transcendentalism after the Civil War. Because abolition is no longer an issue. And of course the climate's changed entirely. Antebellum America before the war is a very optimistic place. Things are growing, there's lots of work, there's opportunities everywhere, people have more leisure time, people are trying to develop themselves, they're developing an American character, they're optimistic about the world. You get a philosophy that comes along and says there is no death, that everything is about right and wrong, that ideals are what's important in the world and not expedience. That's pretty attractive. But after 4 years of slaughter, and 4 years of slaughter which touches everybody, you not only have the people who went to the war and saw the horror and came back disillusioned and pessimistic, but the people who didn't go equally so, for good reason. I mean, almost a whole generation perished in that war, North and South. It was kind of hard to have a class reunion because so many people had died. And not only did they die, if you got shot anywhere but the head or the body, what was the standard procedure? Amputation. So there are always people without arms, without legs, walking around reminding you about what those ideals had cost. Plus, you have 4 years of the people at home going every day to either the courthouse or the newspaper office or the post office to read long lists of tiny print listing the dead and the wounded, and desperately hoping that they weren't going to find the name of a father or a brother or a classmate or a lover on those lists, and you could never get good news. Because if the name wasn't there, it didn't mean they were safe. There were always names left off the list, and if they said they were wounded, by the time they might be dead by the time you found out they were wounded. So the only thing you could get is like 4 years, every day for 4 years, going down, hoping you don't get the worst possible news you can get. And sometimes getting it. But even if you don't get it, anticipating it every day for 4 years takes all the optimism out of it. And don't forget, these were people who had sacrificed their lives for ideals. Some certainly fighting for abolition. Most in the North fighting to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. But either way, it's fighting for an ideal. And most of them at the end of the Civil War, North and South, if you said to them, if we could have shown you what this was going to cost, would you have still fought that war? Most of them would have said, no, absolutely not. No ideal was worth that amount of carnage. So it's a pessimistic America, and it's part of why Transcendentalism more or less fades away. I mean, it's still there, but it's not the dominant force that it had been earlier. And because it does fade away, all of its other reforms suffered from not having that moral and philosophic impetus to push them forward. So America doesn't make the kinds of social and economic leaps forward. Things like Social Security, unemployment compensation, those things wouldn't have had to wait for the Depression of 1930 to come about. The Transcendentalists could have gotten that in 70 years earlier. But they didn't because they got distracted. And of course, eventually, the movement pretty much dissipates because of the pessimism of America. And America goes into a moral decline, which probably hasn't even been equaled yet. But stick around. We're not finished. America's in a decline now, and you realize that. And certainly in a moral decline. And so we may end up being as corrupt as they were in Grant's administration before long. I wouldn't worry about it. I mean, we've had corrupt administrations over and over and over and over again. It's not like it's anything new. The Transcendentalists thought they might have been able to change that, but again, they wasted their force outside of politics. Let's take a break until 8:30, and then we'll finish up Transcendentalism after the break. Check that makeup paper sheet.
So when I see the
Look down at number 10 there, you'll see the series of other characteristics of Transcendentalism. Again, it's romantic idealism. The ideal world is reflected in this world. It's anti-rationalist and anti-mechanistic. Remember, the rationalists believed that the world was a big machine. You could figure out how it worked. The romantics, of course, think that it isn't. It's really a poem. You intend to respond to it with your finest feelings. What they wanted when they wanted to reform Unitarianism is they wanted to change it into religion is the enthusiasm of an affected, fervent heart, not an intellectual exercise, neither theology nor understanding, but a spiritual ecstasy, a super-rational, beyond the rational, communication between the individual soul and the transcendent one or oversoul, which is knowable only through intuition. One of the problems with Transcendentalism is that a whole lot of its basic ideas are inexpressible. They're about transcendent experiences which almost by definition can't be put into words. First, the oversoul itself, the transcendent one. So again, a lot of this stuff may sound like a lot of gibberish to you, but remember, the Transcendentalists didn't have much of a problem with that. The fact that it didn't make sense wasn't any great liability, as long as it felt like it was right. First, there's the transcendent one. Now, except for Emerson, they generally don't use the word God. And Emerson's an ex-minister, so it comes kind of naturally to him. And the reason they use the word, the reason they say the Godhead or the oversoul or the transcendent one, is because as soon as they say God, everybody has this traditional view of an old man with a white beard, keep this in mind, who runs the world. What they're talking about is really something beyond and different from that, something a lot more Eastern in its conception. When things start out, there's pure goodness. And that pure goodness is all there is. And that is the transcendent one, or the oversoul. The oversoul decides to manifest itself physically, to put itself into space and time, and to become what we would call real. When it does that, and here's where the contradiction comes in, it never ceases to be the oversoul. In other words, it makes up the physical world out of itself. On the most basic level, this desk, the rug, all of us are made up out of God stuff. We are made of the oversoul, of the transcendent one. At the same time, we are the transcendent one. The transcendent one puts itself into the physical world, and when it does, it's somehow less perfect than it is outside of the physical world. As it's in the physical world, it evolves towards its own perfection again, and will eventually emerge from the physical world back as perfect as it was. At the same time, none of this actually is happening. It's already happened. From the view of the oversoul, which is outside of time and space, its sojourn in the physical world is already over. But from inside the physical world, it's still going on, and it's an evolutionary process. In order to experience its travels in the physical world and as the physical world, the oversoul needs to open up windows on its experiences, sensory organs, eyes, basically. Each one of us is an eye of the oversoul, looking at its own experiences. Each one of us that's why we're unique. We're all a one-of-a-kind window on the oversoul's experience in the physical world. At the same time, we are also all individually, personally, the whole entire Oversoul itself. So the Oversoul is itself complete, and it's also complete in us, but we just don't recognize it complete in us. And its experience of itself through us is different than its experience of itself as itself. Now, this is one of the reasons why the Transcendentalists believe in reincarnation. Now, of course, they picked that up from Hindu philosophy, from the East. But it's kind of reasonable if you think, why would the Oversoul create a unique apparatus, you and I, for experiencing itself, and then only open that up for 70 years out of who knows how many billion? Probably it wouldn't. It would open that particular window over and over again. So in other words, there's a you, not necessarily with the same body, not necessarily with the same face or even the same gender, but the same personality, the same unique way of reacting to things. Now, and in the 15th century, and the 11th century, and in the cave days, and 2 centuries from now, and 100 centuries from now. There's a you in every time there is, experiencing the Oversoul in your unique way. Nobody ever dies because nobody's really alive. We're always the Oversoul. The Oversoul lasts forever. That's where their idea that nothing dies comes in, because we're all the Oversoul. The Oversoul is immortal and eternal and exists outside of space and time, and that's us. I know it's kind of hard to hold in your mind at the same time that we are both the Oversoul complete and the Oversoul sensory organ at the same time, but the Transcendentalists didn't have too much of a problem with it, or they were used to stuff that just couldn't be explained. Sometimes we are aware of ourselves as the Oversoul. It's kind of like everybody is a camera with 2 lenses. Each individual is the close-up lens of the Oversoul. So all we see is what you see through a close-up lens, this tiny little fragment of the whole experience of things. The Oversoul itself has everybody's experience who ever lived or will live simultaneously, and is aware of all of them at the same time. It's why the Transcendentalists see violence or treating somebody else badly as futile, because there is nobody else. We're all the Oversoul. It's just the Oversoul's right hand smacking the Oversoul's left hand. You don't hurt anybody except yourself, because you're the Oversoul. When we're in this wide-angle state, we know everything that there is, because we're the Oversoul. Problem is, when we come back into this narrow close-up, ourselves as ourselves, we either can't remember it, or we can't express it anymore. Because the thoughts of the Oversoul and the understanding of the Oversoul are so vast, they're beyond any limited expression of them. And they're beyond anything that can be put into words. All we generally bring back is a feeling of wholeness, a kind of serenity, a euphoria, a perception of being part of something larger than ourselves. Now, in the somewhere in the 80s, the Reagan 80s, which were certainly not the 60s, the New York Times, which was anything but a radical publication, did a survey to find out how many people had had transcendent experiences. A transcendent experience is when you become the Oversoul. And they defined it as a loss of the boundaries of self. You feel like you're somehow now suddenly part of something greater than yourself. A sense of the absolute rightness of things. A feeling that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. And everything is happening exactly the way it's supposed to happen. A kind of euphoria that comes with that. A serenity that comes with that. Loss of a sense of time, as well as a loss of a sense of self. This feeling of immersion or of oneness, sometimes called oceanic feelings. You feel part of the great ocean of things. the feeling after the experience ceases, there's a kind of lingering experience of the rightness of everything and of your place in it. And what they found was 85% or more of Americans that had such feelings. These experiences obviously are not uncommon. A great many people have them. Often they don't recognize them. We have them in different circumstances. For example, it's what Yeats talks about when he says, we cannot tell the dancer from the dance. When you dance, and I mean when you really dance, dance dances. You don't actually dance. Dance happens through you. Sometimes it's almost like you stand apart, watching yourself do this. And all these graceful movements, none of which are planned in advance. I'm not talking about a ballet or something that's structured. When people dance for joy, none of that's planned. And it all happens in this perfect fluidity. So it happens to dancers. It happens to athletes all the time. It's what's sometimes called being in the zone. When you do your sport and everything you do is perfect, often time seems to slow down. They did a study with a bunch of NFL wide receivers. And they all talked about how when they go out to make the catch, the ball is this big. And everything slows down and lights up. Everything starts to go into slow motion. Their awareness is completely enhanced. That's an experience of the transcendent. When you're doing your sport to perfection, you're not even there. You're sort of outside of it somehow. You're never thinking about it. In fact, if you ever start to play anybody and you want to win at all costs, and they're in the zone, all you have to do is say, wow, that was great. How did you do that? As soon as you do, it's like saying to the caterpillar, how do you move all those legs at one time? Can't be done anymore. They'll fall apart. Just in case you're ruthless enough to want to win that battle. So the zone is a way of experiencing it. Some people experience it in a religious context. When they go into a place that they consider sacred, they feel what the Puritans were talking about when they talk about feeling God's presence. They feel part of something larger and greater than themselves, and that there's something going on that is not of their doing, but is going on perfectly the way it should. And there's an uplifting feeling to that. It makes people feel relaxed and accepting of things, and they come out of it without tension and without anger and without any negative emotions at all. Kind of general euphoria and serenity. Sex is another thing. The ideal of sex where you become one with the other person. Now, not when you get tangled up and don't know whose foot is whose. This is when you actually lose the boundaries of yourself. When you don't know where they stop and where they end and you begin. Where you become one being. And sometimes you vanish entirely. It's not that you fell asleep. That happens too. Guys especially. This is when, for a moment, you just stop being there. You become everything. Not that this happens all the time. And again, it's one of those things where basically all I can say about it is you had to be there. But that's a transcendent experience. Meditation, forms of meditation are designed to create transcendent experiences. Now, when you meditate, there's all kind of different ways to do it. You can count your breath in and out. You can stare at a complex object until it starts to lose all meaning and it starts moving around, and then it starts to change, and then you lose your whole perspective and become part of the object. You can just let your thoughts run. Don't try to analyze them, just let the thoughts run through your head. It's called letting your mind run away with itself. And you'll get into this state. And the state is one where time ceases. One of the reasons why people meditate, and the East has always been very big into meditation, but the Transcendentalists, when they talk about communing with nature, we're talking about a form of meditation. You meditate sitting up because you'll disappear. Set your watch or whatever, you meditate, an hour goes by, and you have no recollection of its passing at all. You feel enormously relaxed, you feel a lot better and a lot happier. Sometimes you feel like you're still part of whatever it was you were part of when you weren't consciously here. Now, again, the reason you do it sitting up, you didn't fall asleep and start dreaming. When you go into delta sleep, your muscles all lose turgidity and you fall over. So you meditate, you end up on your side, you didn't have a transcendent experience, you went to sleep. But you're still sitting up, you can't have gone to sleep. Where did that hour go? Who was here during that hour? And probably the most common one, how many of you have driven somewhere, say an hour or so away, that you drive pretty frequently, and you have landmarks along the way, and you remember landmark 5, and all of a sudden you're at landmark 26.
Oh, yeah.
Where did that last hour go? Who was driving the car?
It's scary.
There's no, and it isn't like you remember thinking about something and you were lost in thought. It's gone. Now that's the transcendent, what you had was a transcendent experience. The reason you didn't crash, of course, is because you were at that point at one with the Oversoul. You're flowing, what the Eastern religions call the Tao, the flow of things, is the Oversoul unfolding in the physical world. It's unfolding in a particular way, and you're going with that flow. That's why you're not aware of it. You are aware of it as the Oversoul, but when you wake back up again, in quotes, at landmark 21, you're back into your individual self as opposed to being in your transcendent self. This accounts for two doctrines which seem contradictory, the one and the many, and unity and variety. And what the one and the many means is that we are all one, because we are all the transcendent one. We are all the Oversoul. We're the many because we're the Oversoul in disguise as each of us, perceiving the world through our unique sensibilities. But we never stop being one. Even when you're you, you're only aware of being you, but you are still the Oversoul. Outside of this little mask is the rest of the Oversoul, still there, and it never goes away. Unity and variety is each one of us is absolutely unique. We're one of a kind. But at the same time, we are all the Oversoul. So we're all one. Those contradictions aren't contradictions at all to the Transcendentalists. It just depends on whether you are focusing on your awareness of the world and yourself as the Oversoul, or whether you are focusing on your awareness of the world and yourself as an individual soul. But you're always both simultaneously. And an awful lot of Transcendentalists believe that you are both in all times and all places. There's a you everywhere and every when. The ultimate reality is a spiritual one. It's the Oversoul that's real. Like Plato said, this perception of the unfolding of the Oversoul in the physical world is real as far as it goes, but it's nowhere near the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is the Oversoul outside of space and time, complete in its perfection. The physical world is empirically real. When we live in the real world, we do live in it and we're impinged on by the real world, but ultimately it has no effect on us. No matter what happens to us in this world, we're still the Oversoul. We're still completely perfect. And eventually we become aware again completely of being the Oversoul.
I have two questions.
Sure.
I'm sorry. One was with the meditation, did they believe that the soul left the body?
Not necessarily. The soul is always out of the body, in the sense that the Oversoul is always outside, but it's also always inside. It's another one of those things that seems like an inherent contradiction. They didn't deal as much with things like transcendental meditation, the idea that your soul leaves and travels in the astral plane. They didn't have that kind of a philosophy to it. But they did feel that your awareness changed. You don't actually leave the body because you're always outside the body anyway because you're the Oversoul. What was the second one?
The second one had to do with Taoism and the Buddhism, and how, especially Buddhism, there's stuff like salvation, and they reached that. Did they ever reach that level, or did it always continue as reincarnating?
If you have 20 Transcendentalists in a room, you have 20 different versions of what Transcendentalism is.
Right.
Some of them, all of them were influenced by Buddhism and Eastern religion, but they were influenced to varying degrees. So that some would have said, like Swedenborg says, that there's a series of incarnations in which you learn things. Now they would have stressed less that idea of guilt and karma. You do bad things, you come back as a lawyer. They would have stressed that you learn certain things and you fail to learn certain things, and when you come back, you got to learn those things in the next spiral until you have learned all of the things that there are to learn. So they would have emphasized the idea of guilt and payback and stuff a lot less than the Eastern. They just took from every idea they may come across just the parts they liked. They didn't take the thing whole. So although they have a lot of stuff in common with Taoism and Buddhism, they don't accept the whole theology. They don't accept the whole philosophy. They just take it where it seems to work with what they do. Now when they get to, what I forgot was that they did what they called commune with nature. And with that, and if you want to have a transcendent experience, go out and sit in the woods. Don't bring a Walkman along. Don't bring anything to read. Just go in the woods and sit for as long as it takes. And if you sit quietly, at first, this is enormously hard for Americans to do. You go without TV for some length of time. This is next to impossible. Don't bring your cell phone or your pager or anything else. Go and sit in the woods and just sit there. And what will happen is if you sit long enough, you'll vanish. You'll disappear. You'll become one with nature, which is what the Transcendentalists were talking about. And as you'll see, it's one of the reasons why Thoreau encourages us to go out and sit in nature. But he doesn't, you notice that he doesn't give us his experiences. He doesn't try to describe his transcendent experiences. How come?
Because it's his.
Because it's his. It wouldn't be yours. All describing his enlightenment does is tell you how it was like for him. It's different for everybody. And you have to get there on your own. So all he can really do is encourage you to go there. He can't take you out in the woods, and he can't tell you what happens to him when he goes to the woods, but he can set it up so you want to go. And if you go and sit in the woods, you will have a transcendent experience if you wait there long enough. See if I missed any of these things. The root of all things is not in matter but the mind. In other words, it's the perception of the world that counts. And of course, the perception of the world is ultimately a moral perception. When it says that the oversoul, I'm trying to find where that is. Moral law, down under I. Moral law is literally the one, the oversoul. The world is made up of the oversoul. Everything that happens in it is part of the oversoul. Ultimately, if you really press the Transcendentalists, they would have to come to the conclusion that there is no evil in the world. All there is misunderstood good. From the perspective of the oversoul, all of the things that look bad really aren't. They're all part of this larger experience of good unfolding in the world. And it goes maybe from lesser good to greater good. It passes up a gradient over the millennia, but it's still all good. It's all moving to the same end. The world is tragic. Terrible things will happen to you. Terrible things will happen to the people that you love. That happens to everybody. However, those things are only tragic if death is the end of everything. If it turns out we're all the oversoul and nobody dies anyway, then this was just a trip to the funhouse. And yeah, you went on the scariest part of the ride and the saddest part of the ride. It was still a ride. You were still the oversoul testing out what the parameters of goodness are in the physical world. And ultimately, you come out of it and you're still the oversoul. And so those experiences, those losses, are not losses at all because none of those people ever die. None of those people ever vanish. All the awful things that happen to you happen to the oversoul. And the oversoul wants them to happen, wants to experience them. So it's only from our limited perspective that evil seems to exist. Ultimately, it doesn't because it's all the good. And it's all the oversoul. It's all unfolding. And when you act with the oversoul and go with the flow of the oversoul, then of course you are perfection itself. That's where that good feels good comes from. When you're flowing with the oversoul, everything feels perfect. When you're going against the grain, it doesn't feel perfect. That tells you you're swimming upstream. Go with the way the oversoul is going. You follow your heart, you follow the inevitable flow of the oversoul through this world, which is toward greater and greater perfection. There's a reaction against Unitarian utility, the idea that good is doing good for people, that it's got practical ends. Good is good itself. It hasn't got any end, it is the end. And the oversoul is what it is. One of the reasons why the transcendental hero is different than everybody else is that they bring more back from their transcendent experience. Everybody has them, and when we have them, we get insights into where we ought to be going. We don't bring those insights necessarily back in the form of words, but we bring them back in the form of intuition. You're the oversoul, you look at the oversoul unfolding to the physical world. Oh, look, there's me. Oh, that's where I'm supposed to be going. Then you come back, you forget all that, or you can't word all that, but you still have that greater perception of it that acts as an intuition that guides you towards it if you listen to your heart. Again, it's back to being romanticism again.
Isn't it really hard to have a transcendental experience? I mean, like as far as meditation, I tried meditation before, and to me it's like the hardest thing to discipline your mind, to let go of everything.
There's the contradiction. One of the reasons why it's difficult is because a lot of meditation stresses disciplining your mind when in fact you want to be doing just the opposite. It may be that you need a different form of meditation. One of the forms of meditation is letting go. You don't try to do anything with your mind. You just let it run. And if you do, in other words, don't try to analyze your thoughts. Don't try to make sense of them. Just observe them as they're passing through your mind. Pretty soon, it'll go and you'll disappear.
It's hard though, because you keep saying to yourself, okay, another thought comes in and you say, oh, I had another thought.
But that's why you stop yourself.
Yeah, and all the disciplined forms of meditation, and there is a way to get there. I mean, there are people who can get there by narrowing the number of their thoughts. But not everybody can get there that way. Not all forms of meditation are right for all people. You have to try different kinds until you find the one you want. And sometimes it's, the Transcendentalists were right. A lot of people have it just by going and sitting alone in the woods. And at first, you'll be listening to bird songs, and if you're real scientific, you'll be identifying what kind of bird it is. But after a while, sometimes, it isn't necessarily going to be a whole hour the first time, and you go, oh, I get to be sundown already. Sometimes it's only a minute or two you disappear for. And the chances are you've already done it. You just haven't recognized that. In other words, people have transcendent experiences all the time. They just don't recognize them.
Do you feel it when you wake up? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you feel it like when you wake up? Like when you wake up and you're back in, you know what I mean? Do you feel like, I don't know how to describe it. Did you ever feel yourself slip away and you're not thinking about anything and then 2 seconds later you snap back out of it and you're like, whoa, okay,
Yeah.
I'm back. That's what happens. That's what it is. Except it's that, but at a deeper level. It's like you let go even more.
And it's
But,
longer.
Yeah.
What happens is the West is so intellectually oriented that as soon as your intellect starts to lose control and you start to open up, your intellect goes, whoa! And that's when it's almost like when you're falling asleep and you jerk awake. It's that kind of a feeling, but it really has nothing to do with sleep. It has to do with the conscious, rational side of the brain yielding control to the holistic side of the brain, which is another way of looking at it.
So you've done it?
Yeah, it's that control.
That's brain. You've done it?
Sure. It's not uncommon. Transcendental experiences. I'll tell you a transcendental experience. How many times have you ever seen a sunset? Now, you see sunsets all the time. You're driving along and go, oh, yeah, that's pretty. But every once in a while, you see the one that just you have to stop and look at. That's a transcendental experience. For a brief moment, it wasn't just the refraction of light by the atmosphere. For a moment, it becomes more than that. That's what arrests your attention. The fact that you're seeing through to the cosmic. You might think it's only a sunset, but it isn't. That sudden perception of exceptional beauty isn't just that it's a different color than you've ever seen in a sunset. That was the breakthrough. That was when you saw the oversoul in the world. You saw it through the sunset. Or you saw it through, I mean, you can see it through anything. The problem is that we keep looking for these experiences in special spiritual, philosophic contexts. And when we have them outside of that, we go, oh, well, that wasn't one.
What about like with emotions, like with another person? Like if you shared something?
Yeah, I think I'd use sex, but it's not just that. There's some, there are times in relationships when there's a moment of a kind of a loving connection between people. And you're one person for a while. It's relatively brief, and it doesn't happen all the time.
Feel it. You're like,
It
oh.
goes beyond, as you said, the intellect.
Oh, absolutely.
It goes beyond the intellect.
Yeah. That's, my ex-boyfriend. I went out
Yeah,
for 4
yeah,
years.
exactly.
We'd break up,
Just like a sunset.
and
you were
I'd
saying.
know when he was thinking about me.
When
I'd
you
be
look
like,
at
what?
it,
Stop. I
when
call
you're
him,
driving
just
by,
like, keep bugging
you're
me.
thinking, oh, the sun's going down.
Like, no, I...
You think of, oh, it's going to be going up someplace else, but when you stop and look at it, you think of it as maybe like a miracle.
Yes, you see it as a miracle. You don't really. The key is that you don't really think about it at all. When you have a transcendent experience, it's outside of thinking. It's outside of the rational framework. And that's why it's so hard to talk about. That's why mostly what you have to say to people is, you had to be there. The thing is that almost everybody has been there. It's just that they don't recognize that they've been there. And in fact, one of the things we're going to look at...
Once they do, they start to rationalize.
Yes,
Once
because
they do, then all of a sudden you said the left brain takes over and says, well, that happens because of this.
You've all had 12 or 13 years of explaining stuff. And everybody's got that, the Howard Cosell inside your head, doing play-by-play on everything that happens to you, making comments on it, trying to make sense of it. When he shuts up, then you're having the transcendent experience. And sometimes you have to overwhelm your senses. I forgot one way that people get the transcendent experiences all the time, and that's the use of drugs. That's one way to shut up that talking voice in your mind. What do drugs affect? Your intellect, your
That's an
emotion?
illusion, though, isn't it?
Your intellect.
No, only the rationalists. Now, Ben Franklin and the rationalists would say that any drug, alcohol, doesn't matter what the drug is, that you're paralyzing your intellect. The intellect is the only thing that separates us from the brute beasts, and it's therefore the most heinous crime you can commit, to voluntarily destroy the characteristic that separates us from the animals. It's a terrible thing. On the other hand, the romantic says the reason you can't see the world in this way all the time is because your intellect's in the way. The intellect is the enemy. Any way you get rid of the intellect. The rationalist says you paralyze the intellect, you can't see the world. The romantic says as long as the intellect is working, you can't see the world. And it doesn't matter how, when you paralyze the intellect, the romantic would argue that what you're seeing is not a hallucination, but the way your vision would always be if the intellect didn't continually take it away from you. So most of the romantics didn't have anything against taking drugs. A romantic would really only be against that when it begins to harm. Remember, if it feels good, do it. Well, when it starts to make everybody around you unhappy, when all of your friends can't look you in the eye anymore, when you betray all of the stuff you believe in because you have to have, and again, when we think of drugs, anything can be a drug. Anything from white sugar to golf to sex, whatever it is. When you start sacrificing everything else and you are making everybody around you miserable, as a romantic, what would that tell you?
It doesn't make you feel good anymore.
Then it doesn't make you feel good anymore. How good could you feel making everybody else feel bad? So in other words, to romantics, it's not like the classical philosophy is saying drugs are okay within moderation, it's only at the extremes they're bad. The romantic would say as long as you're happy and everybody around you is happy, they're fine. When you start making everybody around you unhappy, then obviously it's not a good thing anymore because it doesn't make you happy. In other words, there are some times when you want to be out of your rational mind, and there are some times when you don't, when you shouldn't be. And your heart will tell you when those times are if you accept what the romantics said. So the romantics would really say that your experience under drugs is the real one. Some people need something to shut up that voice in their head
It's recess.
and to get them to relax. Yes, recess.
That's why they give recess to kids in school, because they've been sitting inside the desk all day. And of course, they want to get them out and run around, get all that energy out so they can.
And the
bring them back
difficulty
in.
comes when you have recess and nobody will come back into school.
Uh-huh.
That's the problem with drugs. Drugs aren't the problem, the abuse of drugs are the problem. And it's a very thin line. I mean, it's a slippery slope. You have to be very aware of yourself to be able to say when you've gone to, you're doing drugs and when drugs are doing you. So the romantic would say one experience possibly, just enough to put you out of your rational framework. Might be all you need. And that isn't the right way for everybody. But it's not necessarily a hallucinatory experience. That's only the rationalists who explain it that way. For the romantics, what you're having right now is the hallucination. The idea that you're in control of anything. Either the scientists are right, this is a random universe, everything happens by accident and you have no control of nothing, or the romantics are right and there's some divine force running everything, in which case you don't have any control. All you really do is go along for the ride and enjoy as much of it as you can. Getting outside of that perspective, again, that was one way. It's not necessarily a way I advocate, but it's certainly not one that any romantic would say was illegitimate. Unless you stay there all the time. Then, of course, it becomes a problem. In fact, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to the kind of, it's called Zen teaching. Now, the transcendental hero has these special experiences, but he can't bring them back in words. And he wouldn't bring them back in words anyway, because they would only be his enlightenment. You have to get yours. So all he can do is set it up so you can. And this is the example. It's called Zen teaching. 16th century Japan, there's a guy, he wants his son to become, he's a samurai, he's a warrior. He wants his son to become a great swordsman. He takes him up into the mountains and turns him over to this little old man, it's always a little old man, the master of the sword. The old man puts him to work pulling up weeds and chopping wood. While he's doing that, the old man pops up out of nowhere and smacks him with a stick. And he does this repeatedly. When the kid sleeps, the little old man pops up out of nowhere and whacks him with a stick. This goes on for several years until one day the kid is weeding. The old man pops up. Without looking up, the kid reaches up, catches the stick, takes it away from the old man, stands up, bows, hands it back to them. The old man bows, and the kid goes home a master of the sword. Now you notice that no time was this intellectualized, no time was it explained, but what the old man was doing was continually creating experiences in which the student could have enlightenment. For example, why does he put him to work weeding and chopping wood? To build up his strength. Have you ever seen a samurai swordsman? It's a wide stance like that. You have to hold the sword like this. You've got to have a lot of upper body strength, and you have to have good strong wax on, wax off. So he's building his legs up, and he doesn't say, Unit 1, physical fitness, lower body physical fitness, how we're going to work on that. Instead, he simply creates experiences where that's going to happen. Now, he jumps up whacking him with the stick. If you're going to be a great swordsman, rule 1, don't get stabbed. So the first thing you want to teach him is get out of the way of the swords. How does he do that? He whacks him with the stick. It's not long before the kid is not taking the blows on his head anymore. He's getting them on the shoulder. He's getting them on the arm. He's getting out of the way. But the old man doesn't say, we're going to practice getting out of the way today. He just keeps whacking him until the kid realizes that, oh, the smart thing to do is to anticipate the blow, to move where it isn't, to understand where his sense of balance is. But he doesn't tell him that. He creates the opportunity for enlightenment. Why pop up and whack him while he's asleep? Well, if you're going to be a swordsman, if you're going to be a swordsman, you're going to kill people. They're going to have relatives. They're going to want to get even. When are they going to come? When you're asleep. If you don't get to be if you're a sound sleeper as a swordsman, you're a dead swordsman. Sooner or later, they're going to kill you in your sleep. But the old man doesn't say to him, you got to learn to be a light sleeper. He just keeps whacking him on the head until the kid starts waking up before he even feels the stick hit him. Now, when he grabs the stick, how did he know it was there? How did he know the old man was there? Well, one of the things... Sorry, Mr. Turner?
Second nature, or it just became second nature?
Yeah, part of it is it becomes second nature to him. In other words, he's there when he's pulling the weeds. You notice when you do kind of work like that, your mind wanders off. You become aware of everything around you. He's in a sense, he's put him in with nature so he can commune. If he were in the West, he would have said, okay, how do you know where people are? Birds. Some birds, when you pass under their tree, make more noise, and other birds make less. So as he's pulling weeds, he notices, without being consciously aware of it probably, that the bird song is changing. Certain birds that were relatively quiet are now relatively loud, and that sound is moving in this direction. So what does that tell you? Yeah, the old man's sneaking up around at a distance. When he gets close, you got to depend on the crickets. The crickets stop making noise when something big stands next to them or when a shadow falls on them. You don't have to watch all around you because the sun's over here. He's not going to attack in that quadrant because his shadow would fall on you. You wouldn't know he was there. He's going to come back here somewhere. So you just listen for the crickets. Okay, now they've stopped right there, so we know he's off to your right. You don't have to catch the stick's pretty thin. But you don't have to catch the stick. He generally whacks you in the head. So if you put your arm up here, it hits, you just slide down it and take the stick away. Now, he didn't tell him any of that. He simply created experiences where he could understand it. Now, when he stands up, why does he bow and hand the stick back to the master? See, it shows that he knew he was being taught. When I came here, I thought you were big on child abuse. Now I realize that you were teaching me something. If you have something more to teach me by hitting me with a stick, here's the stick. Whack away. I'm ready to learn. When the old man bows and hands it back to him, he's saying, time for you to go, grasshopper. What would happen if he took the stick, stood up, and started beating the old man about the head until I've been waiting 3 years for this? What would happen? He would be sent home in disgrace. He'll never be a swordsman. One of the things that, no matter what form of martial arts you take, which, by the way, boy, how did I forget that one? The martial arts are a way of having transcendent experiences. When you start to learn the basic movements as a kind of rhythmic dance, after you've done that a certain number of times, you'll lose yourself in it if you get fairly good at it. Anyway, any form of martial arts will tell you that you're vulnerable when you attack. Almost all forms will teach counter, block, and counterattack. Because when you attack, you expose yourself. If he was still angry at the old man, and he hadn't controlled his temper, and he hadn't really learned the old man wasn't doing this to be mean to begin with, it shows that he's got too much of a temper. Why can't you be a great swordsman if you have a bad temper? You're always going to be attacking, and you're always going to be vulnerable. No matter how good a swordsman you are, you will eventually meet a better one. If you're the kind of person who easily gets angered, that's going to be an insult to you. You're going to fight him. He's going to kill you. There will be times when you're outnumbered, vastly outnumbered. But if you're angry, you won't be able to leave. You won't be able to walk away from that fight. You'll make that fight, and it will kill you. So he has to send him home a failure. He doesn't keep him and try to retrain him, because if he hasn't learned by 3 years to control his temper, he's a dead man. You'll be doing him no favor. Now, you notice he never gave him a sword. But he doesn't need to know that the actual motions of how to manipulate a sword, anybody can teach you. They're not what makes a great swordsman. What makes a great swordsman is all of those forms of awareness, that control and self-discipline. In fact, there's even a form of that. Now, that's Zen teaching. There's also Zen testing. For example, the shogun is getting old. He knows he's going to die, the warrior chieftain. He's got 3 sons. He's not sure who he should pass the throne on to. Puts a pillow over the door and calls in the first son. First son walks in, pillow hits him on the head, bounces off on the floor. Kid says, "What do you want, Dad?" "Not you. Here's some money. Go have fun." Why don't you want to make him the new shogun?
Not aware of his surroundings.
He's not aware that not only did the pillow hit him on his head, he didn't even wonder about it. He just walked on into the room. Puts the pillow back up, second son comes in. Pillow starts to drop, takes out the sword, cuts it 4 pieces before it hits the ground. Now you think, this is the guy. This isn't the guy. Why not?
He automatically thought, he automatically.
He reacted to it. He didn't anticipate anything. He only acted to what presented itself. And his action was violent. And that was the only, he didn't catch the pillow. He cut it in 4 pieces. Now, when you're the shogun, there's going to be people out for your life all the time. Anytime you're in a position like being a king, there are going to be people out to assassinate you. You won't always uncover those plots in time to prevent them. Sometimes they'll be so far advanced, the only way to escape is to have recognized them and to flee. But this guy doesn't flee. This guy simply responds to what's happening. He hasn't got the insight. So if you make him shogun, he may last a while because he'll kill some people who come for him, but sooner or later, he won't. Third son starts to come in, sees the pillow, takes it down, walks over, bows, hands it to his father. His father makes him the new warrior chieftain. Why?
He did the opposite of the other 2 brothers.
He's aware. He anticipates what's going on. And you notice he didn't just find the pillow. He knew why it was there. The second brother cut the pillow in half, but he never asked himself, what was a pillow doing up there? This one said, why is there a pillow? My old man asked me in, there's a pillow up there. Oh, sure, it's a test. I understand what that is. Here you go, Dad. You got any other tests for me? And the father knows. This is a guy who's going to be able to anticipate plots in advance. He's going to uncover those assassination attempts well before he ever gets to them. Now, what Thoreau does is Zen teaching. He doesn't take us out in the woods, although you notice he often leads a huckleberry party. What he does is to write about the woods so compellingly that we want to go out in the woods ourselves. And what will happen when we go out in the woods? We'll have a transcendent experience. Thoreau doesn't have to take us there. We need to go ourselves. The other thing that he does, and this is one of the places, there are lots of places, where Emerson misses the boat of his own philosophy. He sees it as a flaw in Thoreau's style, that Thoreau continually sees things in terms of their opposites. He says he talks about the wilderness and compares it to the streets of Greece and Rome. He talks about things being so cold they were almost hot, so wet that they were dry. Well, whenever he looks at something, he sees something that's the exact opposite of it. If you're going to have a new understanding, a new perception of the world, you can't think the way you've always thought. You have to be able to, remember metaphysical thinking? How it sort of stands from the side and looks at a new angle at things? You have to be able to do that. So what Thoreau does, by making us, because he does this over and over, he creates in the reader the habit of seeing things in terms of their opposite. Seeing things in terms of what they can't be. I mean, wet can't be dry. But if you look at it long enough, you can see ways that it can. So by training us to see the opposite, he allows us to automatically see things in a new way. So he trains you to see things in a new way. Then he encourages you to go out in the woods. It's almost a dead certainty when you go out there that you're going to have a transcendent experience. So he doesn't have to explain it to you, and he doesn't have to tell you the steps that you need to go through. He just sets it up like the Zen master so that you want to go out into the woods, and so you're used to looking at things in a new way. In the old way, you look at ants and you say, oh, they're ants. They're going to go into picnic. Or, those are red ants. They fight with black ants. Oh, this is the kind of ant that is. This is a trail of formic acid that it leaves. What does Thoreau see when he looks at ants? He sees civilization. When he sees ants, he sees human beings. He sees the movements of empires. Because he's used to seeing what isn't there, or what we're not used to. It's always there. Because everything is the oversoul. Because everything is the oversoul, the antithesis of everything is present in its opposite. And so he trains us in that kind of thinking. So what Thoreau does is what a transcendental hero would do. He creates the conditions under which people can have enlightenment. Well, I'll do the transcendental hero next week, and then we'll be applying that to Emerson and Thoreau. We'll probably just get through Emerson. So make sure you read Emerson. The test will be on Emerson. We may get a little bit into Thoreau. The week after that, we're going to be doing Thoreau, and then I think we go on to Walt Whitman. We'll be looking at the next 4 or 5 writers as transcendental heroes. That's why we'll spend some time doing what the transcendental heroes are.
The quiz next week.
Yes, quiz on Emerson next week.